So Dragon's Dogma 2 is currently the game I'm most excited for in 2024, and in a similar way to other RPGs, the thing I'm most excited for is their class system, which is called Vocations. So in this video, I want to go over every vocation that has been officially revealed, and I also want to go over a quick description of every one of those vocations. But before we get into all these specific vocations, I think I need to do a quick explanation of what the vocation system is and how it works, because it works in a bit of a different way than a lot of other RPGs do their classes. So in Dragon's Dogma 2, you play as an Arisen, which is your main character. Now the Arisen can be any vocation in the game, but when starting, you only have access to 4 starter vocations. As you progress more and more into the game, you'll also be able to start to unlock advanced vocations, hybrid vocations, and an even more intricate new vocation that was the most recent one shown off. Now also in Dragon's Dogma 2, you'll also be able to create a main pawn, which is basically your main follower or companion you take with you through basically all of your adventures in the game, and you'll get it pretty early on. Now pawns you'll be able to fully customize as well and create that full character as well, and pawns will also have a vocation that they use, but pawns will only have access to the 4 starter vocations through the entirety of the game. So vocations are not only going to be pretty important for you as the Arisen, the playable character, but also as your main pawn. Now vocations are going to work in a similar way to a lot of classes from other games. You'll have a bunch of different abilities you can go unlock. You'll have different stats that are better for the different vocations, and they're going to play in pretty different ways compared to each other. And this is actually where a lot of the big differences are compared to a lot of other RPGs, because the different abilities for the different vocations you unlock are actually going to come from a lot of different pieces of content throughout the game. One of the main ways is going to be the game's Meisters, which are basically just masters of different vocations. They're story characters or NPCs throughout the game that you meet. You'll do different objectives or quests for them, which will build up your reputation with them, and then they'll teach you new abilities for certain vocations, or they will also be the way that you learn whole new vocations. Now you're probably asking yourself, well, this is a single player game, and if you can only choose 4 starter vocations, how do I get the other ones? Do I have to unlock it then play a new playthrough? And this is also one of the big differences compared to other RPGs, because in Dragon's Dogma 2, you can switch vocations pretty much anytime you want once you get to a certain point of the game. Now from what I've heard, a lot of people are theorizing that it'll probably be like level 10, then you'll be able to choose between any of your other unlocked vocations. So one of the big pieces of progression throughout the entirety of the game is actually going to be to find the Meisters of these other vocations, do the objectives or quests for them, raise your reputation, so they'll actually teach you new vocations that you could then go switch to, have completely different abilities, a completely different playstyle, use completely different weapons, and have a completely different gameplay experience. So a good chunk of the abilities you're learning from all your vocations will come from Meisters, all of the non-starter vocations will come from Meisters, and then you'll also be able to learn abilities from other means throughout the games. I know in the first game you could buy new abilities from vendors, and then you could get some from other pieces of content. So that brings us into the vocations themselves, starting with the 4 starter vocations, which starts with the Fighter. The Fighter vocation excels in melee combat, wielding a sword and a shield. Fighters can slice through enemy ranks and deliver powerful blows while also using their shields to protect themselves and their allies. So the Fighter is going to be your ultra frontline tank. You're primarily going to be using a one-handed weapon and a shield. Even though this says swords, we've been shown a bunch of combat and screenshots of them using maces, a bunch of different types of swords, rapiers, and a bunch of other one-handed melee weapons. And in that vein, there's also a ton of different shields we've seen them use in screenshots or different pieces of gameplay. But the primary thing seems to be they're always going to be using some type of shield and some type of one-handed weapon. And they are really going to play the role as the frontline tank. A lot of those abilities are going to be focusing on those frontline attacks, every different melee attack you could think of, different cleaves. But then because they have a shield, there's actually a lot of different interesting abilities we've gotten to see some glimpses of. For instance, you could put one of your pawns on your shield and boost them up a cliff, or maybe boost them up on a big creature you're fighting so they could grab on the top of a creature. You have abilities that will taunt enemies to you. You have different shield attacks like running and slamming into an enemy with your shield. You can parry attacks with the shield. So if you're looking for a frontline, super tanky warrior type class, the Fighter is definitely what you're going to want to be choosing as your starter class. And then the second of the starter classes being the Archer archer. The archer vocation specializes in long-range attacks using bow and arrows. They perform their attacks from afar and can target enemies in high positions. In addition, they are essential in supporting the front line. For example, by targeting enemy weaknesses, they can create opportunities for your allies to strike. So this is going to be your typical archer. You're the range damage dealer. You can hit weak spots, which can help bring down big monsters, so maybe your melee can then hit their head or other critical positions much more easily. And one of your biggest strengths obviously being that you're a range damage dealer. You can stay back out of harm's way and deal quite a lot of damage. And some of the skills we've been able to see have been a bit more basic. We have like barrages of arrows, you have sweeps of arrows that shoot arrows in kind of a more AoE fashion, you have arrows that can knock down targets. We have seen some abilities that can give you, say, additional sight, so maybe you can see enemies further away. But one of the more interesting parts of the archer is that you will be able to seemingly find different arrows you can use that are consumed. So maybe you find an explosive arrow that will obviously blow up on impact, or a tarring arrow that throws tar on an enemy or in an area that maybe you could light on fire, or it may just slow down enemies. So you'll be able to find a bunch of these different arrows that will give you different effects. Those are obviously going to be consumables, but that can add quite a lot of variation to the archer's gameplay. The third of the starter vocations being the thief. The thief attacks with deadly speed, dealing rapid and consecutive strikes with daggers in both hands while exhibiting outstanding mobility. They quickly step away after striking, exploit openings to cling onto enemies, and inflict heavy damage. They may also steal items from NPCs and enemies. So the thief is really what you expect from a rogue or stealthy melee character. They use two melee weapons. It says daggers here, but a lot of the different weapons they've shown off seem to be quite a bit different than normal daggers, but sticking to those two smaller melee weapons. And they have a very big focus on movement. They're constantly dashing around. They can cling on to bigger enemies, which will allow them to strike these vital spots, or maybe go up to their head and start stabbing the head of a bigger creature. So they're very focused on fast and fluid movement while being able to deal some pretty big focus damage. It doesn't seem like they're going to be really good for AoE, but it seems like they're going to be very quick, and they're going to be able to deal some pretty big focused or single target damage. Some of the abilities we've seen are actually pretty interesting. So you have everything from your bog standard flurry of attack to dashes that are dealing damage as you dash through enemies. We've seen them be able to ignite their blades, so there's even some type of infusing your weapons to do different damage types. We've seen them be able to cloak themselves, throw smoke bombs, and pretty much everything else you would expect from a rogue or a thief class. They're that stealthy, quick fighter that can do some pretty big damage and have quite a lot of utility to control enemies, to stun them, and then to be able to get out quickly. And that brings us to the fourth and final starter vocation, the mage. Wielding a staff, the mage offers support to their party in various ways, from launching magical attacks, offering enchantments that bolster their party members' weapons, to casting healing spells. The more advanced and powerful the magic is, the longer the incantation time will be. As a mage, you will experience the strategic excitement of deftly executing your magic abilities. So the mage is kind of playing a few different roles compared to a lot of other RPGs mages, because usually when you think of a mage, you think of a caster that's primarily just dealing damage, or casting fireballs or lightning bolts. They're primarily a damage dealer, but the mage in Dragon's Dogma 2 can do a lot more than that. They can still deal different damaging attacks, lightning bolts, flame attacks, but they're also the primary supporter of the game. So they can do things like enhance the weapons of all their party to make them deal more damage, or deal a fire attack on one of their next attacks, or boost different elements of your party, like casting a sigil that hastens their speed. And then you just also have mages being the healer. We've seen this in a bunch of different gameplay. The mage is casting big AoE heals, or even smaller circle heals, but they are seeming to be the main healer of the game. So I would probably expect a mage to be one of the most popular vocations to be in someone's party, whether it be through your main pawn, or you want to always hire a mage pawn from another player, or maybe you just being the mage and you want to be the supporter of all your pawns. I would expect mages are probably going to be very popular. And that's not even all they can do, because we've actually seen some additional stuff, like they can create, say, a pillar of ice that's actually something you can walk up on. So maybe you're trying to get on a ledge, you create a pillar of ice, you and your pawns can get up on that ice pillar and then get up on that ledge. So they're also going going to have a bit of unique utility to them as well. Now that brings us to the next set of vocations, because as mentioned, you can only choose one of the 4 starter vocations once you start the game. But as you progress throughout the game, meet more maesters and increase your reputation with them, they can start to teach you more vocations. And the second grouping of vocations are advanced and hybrid vocations. So that brings us to one of the 2 advanced vocations, the warrior. The warrior boasts a robust physique specializing in direct combat with the strength to endure enemy counterattacks. Warriors are masters of 2-handed weapons such as the great sword and the hammer. The strike that is unleashed after charging power and identifying an opening is among the most powerful attacks of all vocations. So the warrior is kind of an offshoot of the fighter, but instead of being a one-hander and shield user, they're using massive 2-handed weapons. Sword, maces, spears. It looks like basically any 2-handed weapon you could possibly think of, you'll be able to use on a warrior. They're the big 2-handed user that has really slow charged up attacks, but when those attacks land, they're doing the highest damage of any other vocation. I'm sure this will be a very popular vocation once people learn how to unlock it. And the developers actually singled out this vocation specifically when comparing it to the first game, because the first game's version of the warrior was not very strong. So they changed this one up quite a bit and they want to make it very, very strong. But there's a pretty big downside in that your attacks are all kind of slow charge up attacks. So you can be counterattacked. But again, if you hit these big attacks, you're destroying anything in front of you. And we have seen a bunch of different abilities, a lot of which are big charged up attacks. We have spins that just kind of spin you through all enemies, dealing AoE damage. We've seen even bigger charged up attacks just slam down and destroy enemies. We've seen that they also have a big bellow to basically taunt all enemies in the area. Warriors also seem to be pretty tanky, even though they're not using a shield. We've seen things where they kind of give themselves a second wind and can remove different negative effects from themselves. I would be very surprised if there wasn't an effect that allows you to maybe heal the lower health you are, so you kind of get that second wind when you're low, kind of a more barbarian or fury type of play style, to where you're constantly taking a lot of damage, but you're able to kind of keep yourself alive even though you're low health. So if you're someone that likes that frontline gameplay and you want to just use the biggest weapon you could find, the warrior's for you. And then the second of the 2 advanced vocations is the sorcerer. The sorcerer is a vocation completely specialized in various magic attacks. Their magic is conjured with both hands through a large staff and can change the tide of battle at any given opportunity. As their magic spells take longer to cast, it is key for the sorcerer to find a safe space and determine the correct moment to strike. So this is kind of a variation to the mage. And I think one of the coolest parts of the sorcerer is that they're casting these massive spells through their big 2-handed staff. But I think the biggest differentiating piece from the sorcerer to the mage is that the sorcerer is doing these really long cast abilities that are just massive. They're conjuring big storms or massive meteors or even whole tornadoes that take a long time to cast and get off. But when they get this cast off, it's one of the most devastating abilities that can be used in the game. Casting a massive tornado that could pick up huge creatures is incredibly strong, but as mentioned in the description, you have to find some place safe to do this. If you're casting a really long spell, any enemies could just come up and attack you if you're not positioned correctly. Now, one thing I'm not 100% sure on is the sorcerer's ability to support. It seems like from most of the things we've seen, the sorcerer is mainly focused on massive damage or even some utility spells. Like if you cast a big tornado, it's probably going to deal a lot of damage, but it'll probably also have a pretty big CC effect, where if you're knocking up all enemies into a tornado, they can't really attack you. So I'm not sure if this sorcerer is going to be able to do a bunch of supporting abilities like buffing your allies or healing your allies, or if they're just primarily going to be focused on only these massive damaging abilities. If you're someone that just wants to cast the biggest and craziest spells, the sorcerer is what you're going to want to be playing. And that brings us to the hybrid vocations, starting starting with the Magic Archer. Available only to the Arisen, the Magic Archer vocation excels in long-range combat with their magical arrows. In addition to attacking or healing, magical archers are also adept at supporting their allies. They can learn a custom skill that unleashes a devastating attack over a wide area in exchange for reducing their own maximum health. So the Magic Archer is basically being a mix of an archer and a mage. It seems that the only weapon they're actually going to be using is a magically infused bow that actually looks quite unique from most other bows, and they're going to be using what seems to be magically conjured arrows. So they're going to be a long-range damage dealer using all of these magically infused bow attacks with their magically conjured arrows, but they're also mixed with a mage, so they'll be able to have healing abilities, they'll be able to have supporting abilities for themselves or their allies, and as shown off in some of the gameplay and mentioned in the description, it seems they're going to have some pretty crazy, massive AoE attacks that deal some crazy damage, but have some downsides to their own HP. And the hybrid vocations in Dragon's Dogma are already pretty unique, but this is one of those combinations that's very unique to most other RPGs we see, from everything from MMOs to single player games. You usually don't see something like this. At most, you usually get an archer that kind of has magically infused arrows or something like that. But this is pretty much a complete mix of mages and archers. And that brings us to the second of the hybrid vocations, the Mystic Spearhand. The Mystic Spearhand, a vocation only available to the Arisen, combines melee and magic, making them a well-balanced vocation that is effective from any range. The Mystic Spearhand is a master of their unique weapon, the Duo Spear. Using magic, they can paralyze enemies to hurl multiple objects at them. And just like the Magic Archer, the Mystic Spearhand is a very unique class design. They use this big dual-sided spear, but have a lot of magic-infused attacks. A lot of the attacks we get to see throughout the gameplay is that they're teleporting around to different enemies. In one of the pieces of footage, there's a griffin flying above them, and the Mystic Spearhand actually teleports up to on top of this flying creature, which just looks pretty incredible, but also gives this vocation a lot of potential power, especially in their movement. And not only this, but they're going to have a lot of other magical effects that kind of feel more like utility built into a melee class. So as mentioned, they could teleport around using their magic. You can paralyze enemies, so you could paralyze an enemy, teleport to it, and then do a big stab. Then they have something that's really cool where they can pick up objects or dead creatures or dead enemies and throw all those objects at other enemies they're fighting to do a bunch of damage. And then they could just teleport on top of the head of a big creature and start stabbing it. So as the Magical Archer almost feels like a 50-50 split between a mage and an archer, maybe even a little bit more of a mage, the Mystic Spearhand seems more of a melee class with a lot of built-in magical utility. So I think if you're somebody that likes a more melee-based class, but you want some of this infused magic, I think the Mystic Spearhand is going to be exactly what you're looking for. Now that brings us to the final hybrid vocation, the Trickster. A vocation exclusive to the Arisen, the Trickster can conjure illusions through the smoke created by its unique weapon, the Censer. Tricksters can use illusions to deceive enemies into fighting against their own. They also have the ability to temporarily increase the power of pawns beyond their limits. Now the Trickster is a pretty interesting one because as you look at the Magical Archer or the Mystic Spearhand, their symbol is actually the two different colors of the class that combines to make the hybrid vocation. The Magic Archer has blue, which is the color of the mage or the sorcerer, and yellow, which is the color of the archer. So that's the two colors that make up its symbol. On the Mystic Spearhand, they have red, which is either the fighter or the warrior, and then blue, which is the mage or the sorcerer. So they're a mix of those two other vocations. The Trickster is purple and pink. Now this could be like a combination of other colors to get these colors, but this is one of the most unique and weird vocations in the game because it doesn't really seem to be combining any other vocations, which is also, I think, one of the reasons why so many people have the theory that there's more vocations in the game we haven't been shown yet. The Trickster is really cool. They're kind of not a direct damage dealing class. They more create these illusions and then even make enemies fight themselves. So they can create illusions to make enemies fight that. They can just make enemies fight each other. They also showed something really cool, which it created a massive illusion of a dragon doing like a fire breath attack that actually does a ton of damage dodge and ends up killing this griffin in the gameplay. So they're a very unique vocation that is primarily focused on buffing their own pawns, but also just creating bunches of different illusions and pretty much just deceiving all of their enemies. Now there's one final vocation that seems to be in its own category, because if you go and look at all the vocation symbols, they actually have different borders that get more intricate. So the 4 starter vocations have kind of basic borders. Then you have the advanced and hybrid vocations that all share a similar, more intricate border. And then finally, we have the warfare that has this really big golden, super intricate border, which kind of fits what this vocation is. The warfare is a new vocation exclusive to the Arisen that can use every weapon and learn different abilities from each vocation. By using diverse weapons, the warfare can respond to any situation and create combos that cross vocational boundaries. The warfare's lower base stats require them to utilize the situational strengths of different weapon types to be on par with other vocations with specialized strengths. So the warfare is basically a combination of other vocations in abilities and weapons. If you go to hybrid vocations, they're mixing 2 vocations but making something unique to itself from those. The warfare is just using everything from every other vocation. So you can weapon swap between seemingly 3 different weapons at a time, and you'll have different abilities from those different vocations to the weapons you switch between. So maybe one section of a warfare could switch between a 2-handed axe, a bow, and dual one-handed weapons. And then switching to those different weapons will give them different abilities of the vocation that normally uses that weapon. Now, as mentioned, they're going to have lower base stats. They're not going to be as strong as the other vocations outright, but because you can switch weapons and have access to all these different abilities, your strength is going to come from your situational potential. And they actually showed some of this, so it was pretty interesting. A character that was wearing like all mage robes created a ice wall or ice step in front of a creature that knocked the creature back and then allowed that mage to switch to a 2-handed sword, jump off the ice they just created, and hit this big creature in the head. So that's a pretty good combination to see that you have to use all of these different elements to be strong and effective. And the warfare also seems like it's going to be pretty interesting in unlocking throughout the game, because what it sounds like to me is you're going to kind of have to master a bunch of different vocations, maybe even all of them, to unlock the warfare. So maybe you have to go complete all of the different things for all the different meisters throughout the game to be able to actually unlock the warfare to even be able to use it. So it's going to be a really intricate vocation, but it's going to be really cool to play and very interesting. It also seems like it may be used as kind of an end game reward to where you've completed a ton of content, so you kind of get this reward that allows you a very unique and new play style. So that's all of the vocations we currently know of for Dragon's Dogma 2, but this may not be all vocations because there's been quite a lot of theories built around Dragon's Dogma 2, and a lot of players think that there may be more vocations that they haven't shown off, that they may even not show off, that they just want to be as a secret or a surprise once we get the game, start going through the questing and maybe meet some meisters, and maybe we find a new vocation that they never showed off. Especially when you go and look at the trickster, like I mentioned, it's 2 different colors that is not from any of the other vocations. So it would make sense that there are other vocations in the game that they're not showing us yet, or that they maybe just haven't shown us yet. But this is all the vocations we've officially been shown. And again, this is what makes me most excited for the game. There's so much different options and possibilities, and a lot of these abilities and even different vocations come from progressing throughout the game, which is something that I think is also pretty exciting as well. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.